Buy the wrong boat, and depreciation won't just nibble at your investment, it can take a real bite. Boats generally lose the largest share of their value during the early years of ownership, then the pace of that decline tends to slow. A small handful of boats have historically done better than that pattern, holding on to a stronger share of their value than the broader market. Today, we're counting down 7 fishing boats with the strongest historical case for still commanding real money 10 years from now, ranked from a promising value play all the way up to the strongest, most well-documented resale reputation in the industry. One quick disclaimer before we start. Nobody can predict exact future prices. Not us, not a dealer, not an appraiser. Individual condition, engine hours, maintenance history, electronics, and ownership records can dramatically change what any specific boat is actually worth. What we can do is look at decades of evidence, construction philosophy, brand longevity, and documented demand, and use that to identify which boats have consistently stacked the odds in an owner's favor. That's the case we're building today, and we're ranking these 7 from a strong starting point all the way up to the single most well-documented resale case in the industry. Let's get into it. At number 7, Sea Hunt built its entire following on delivering serious capability without the premium pricing of the bigger offshore names, and that positioning may matter more for long-term resale than it first appears. A lower entry price can potentially broaden the pool of used buyers a decade from now, which may help sustain demand even when the broader market softens. That's a reasonable inference based on how pricing typically affects buyer pools, not a documented certainty specific to this brand. The deep V-hull design has stayed largely consistent model to model, rather than being reinvented every few seasons, so older examples don't feel dramatically outdated sitting next to current production. Sea Hunt and its dealer network have pointed to strong used market demand as a selling point, and that claim should be treated as a dealer observation rather than independent proof, though used listings for this brand do tend to move at a pace that suggests real, ongoing buyer interest. Here's the catch. Brand recognition still lags behind the established offshore names, and that gap in prestige could limit how high resale prices climb compared to more recognized competitors over the next decade. Resale outlook, promising, not premium. This is the boat most likely to hold a reasonable percentage of its price without ever commanding a headline number, and that's still a genuinely useful trait for a buyer thinking about resale. If you're buying today with resale in mind, prioritize documented maintenance records over low engine hours alone. A well-documented boat protects future value more reliably than a slightly newer engine. Affordability earns Sea Hunt its spot on this list. But that's not the only way a boat protects its resale value. At number 6, ask a Parker owner if they'd sell, and you'll often get a laugh before an answer. One owner quoted in industry coverage compared the brand to Harley-Davidson. People wait in line for these, and once they buy one, they keep it for life. That's a single owner's observation, not a market-wide statistic, but it lines up with something more measurable. Several independent sources covering the used boat market separately describe good used Parkers as genuinely hard to find. Parker has spent decades refining the same fundamentals instead of chasing redesigns. Thick, overbuilt fiberglass construction that hasn't meaningfully changed since the company's earliest commercial models. That consistency means an older Parker doesn't look or feel dramatically outdated next to something new off the lot. And that scarcity on the used market, combined with sustained buyer interest, is one of the more consistent resale signals in this segment. Now we're moving from affordability into scarcity, and the trade-off here is worth knowing. The ride is firm rather than plush, a trait that's core to the design philosophy rather than a flaw likely to change in future models. Resale outlook, strong, and arguably underrated, since Parker doesn't chase the same spotlight as flashier offshore names, yet the used market scarcity tells its own story. If you're buying with resale in mind, a documented engine service history and a clean transom inspection matter more here than almost anything cosmetic. Parker proves scarcity can be its own form of long-term value. The next boat takes a different route entirely, building its case on a construction process it patented and a warranty most manufacturers wouldn't dare offer. At number 5, imagine a warranty that doesn't expire when you sell the boat, it transfers to whoever buys it next. Everglades offers exactly that on eligible models, and it's a detail that speaks directly to resale value in a way most warranties never do. The company's patented process, called RamCap, uses a high-density foam core pre-molded to fit precisely between the hull and the liner, then cured into one rigid structure rather than assembled from separate components that can shift or flex over time. Everglades states this approach applies across its lineup, and it underpins both the brand's unsinkable positioning and that transferable lifetime hull warranty, a detail that depends on model and production year, so it's worth confirming eligibility on any specific boat rather than assuming it automatically applies. As these boats age, owner feedback continues to describe a notably solid, quiet ride with few structural surprises, and buyers who understand the construction tend to specifically seek this brand out rather than settling for a generic alternative. There's one catch. This construction approach adds cost, so used prices stay elevated even on older models, which protects the floor but raises the entry point. Resale outlook, strong, anchored specifically by that transferable warranty rather than reputation alone. If you're buying with resale in mind, verify whether the lifetime hull warranty on this specific boat is still active and properly transferred, since that detail alone can meaningfully affect what the next buyer is willing to pay. Everglades protects value through paperwork as much as engineering. The next boat protects it by being built for a scenario most owners will thankfully never actually face. At this point, we're leaving the budget-friendly end of the market behind. At number 4. Picture running 60 miles offshore in building seas, the kind of trip where the difference between a good boat and a great one isn't comfort, it's whether you get home. Regulator was built with that scenario in mind. The company's engineering philosophy leans into overbuilding critical structural components, a wood-free stringer system bonded as one solid piece to reduce stress on the hull joints, rather than optimizing purely for speed or fuel efficiency. That's a deliberate trade-off that tends to pay off slowly, over many years, rather than showing up on a spec sheet. Independent brokers selling these boats second-hand describe them as not lasting long on the brokerage market. That observation comes from sellers with a commercial interest in the brand, so treat it as a broker-level signal rather than independent market data, though it's echoed across multiple separate dealerships rather than a single source. That narrow but devoted demand base, serious offshore anglers who prioritize structural confidence above nearly everything else, is part of what keeps resale from collapsing during softer market years, since those buyers don't disappear when trends shift, even if they represent a smaller slice of the overall market than a boat like Sea Hunt or Parker. The trade-off is that maintenance and fuel costs run higher than average, since these boats typically carry larger, more powerful engines suited to their offshore mission. Resale outlook, strong within its niche, though narrower in broad market appeal than some other boats on this list. If you're buying with resale in mind, engine hours relative to age matter enormously here, since a boat run hard offshore for a decade wears very differently than one used occasionally. If you're finding this breakdown useful, take a second to hit like and subscribe to Harborhook Boats. We dig into the evidence behind these decisions, so you're buying based on documented history, not just a good-looking listing photo. Now we're getting into a completely different kind of advantage. At number 3, Contender didn't build its reputation by trying to please everyone. It built it by refusing to compromise on offshore speed without sacrificing structural integrity, and that narrow focus has become a genuine resale advantage. Every hull is hand-laminated with reinforced construction, and that labor-intensive process shows up years later in a documented way. Industry coverage of the used boat market specifically notes that Contender boats generally retain value better than many competitors because of that construction approach and reputation for durability, while also noting that resale still depends heavily on condition and maintenance records for any individual boat. Vacuum-infused techniques on newer models create a more consistent layup than older hand-laid methods, and that consistency has remained a defining trait across the brand's history. Demand among serious offshore anglers stays consistently high specifically because these buyers seek Contender out rather than settling for a generalist alternative, and that kind of targeted, passionate demand tends to protect resale better over time than trying to appeal broadly to everyone, even if it's still a narrower buyer pool than the boats ranked above it on this list. The trade-off is that maintenance and fuel costs run higher than average given the larger engines these boats typically carry. Resale outlook, strong and comparatively well documented. One of the more independently verified resale claims on this list. If you're buying with resale in mind, documented maintenance history matters enormously here, since a contender with a clean, verified service record commands a real premium over one without. Contender earns its case through specialization. The number 2 boat takes the resale argument to another level, betting that broad appeal protects value better than narrow focus. At number 2, here's a claim worth testing rather than just repeating. That a well-built boat can lose meaningfully less value over 15 years than a typical competitor loses in 5. Grady White's own marketing has made versions of that claim for years, so it shouldn't be taken as independent proof on its own. But separate, independent marketplaces back up a version of it. One major boat marketplace specifically highlights Grady White as a brand regarded for performance and reliability among fishing enthusiasts. And another independent source separately describes Grady White as the brand with the most loyal following in the fishing and center console category. Language coming from sources with no obvious reason to favor one manufacturer over another. That history. The company was founded in 1959, shows up in a solid fiberglass hull paired with the patented CV2 hull design, engineered to soften the ride and shed spray in a chop, and a deck and interior finish that feels noticeably more upscale than many offshore competitors. Grady White has also received a National Customer Satisfaction Award from the Marine Manufacturers Association every year since it was established, requiring 90% or higher satisfaction ratings, an independently measured mark of ownership satisfaction rather than a marketing claim. Here's an illustration worth sitting with, not a prediction. If a buyer spends $100,000 on a boat and it depreciates $30,000 more than it needed to over a decade, that gap dwarfs almost any difference in fuel economy or maintenance cost most owners will ever notice month to month. That's the kind of gap a strong resale reputation is meant to close, though the exact numbers for any individual boat will vary. The trade-off worth knowing is that replacement parts and factory-authorized service can carry a real premium tied to the brand name. Resale outlook, among the strongest on this list, and unusually well corroborated across independent sources rather than resting on reputation alone. If you're buying with resale in mind, a documented transom and stringer survey protects value here more than almost any single step, since even well-built boats benefit from that structural confirmation after years offshore. Grady White proves broad appeal can be its own long-term value strategy. But nothing on this list has protected its value quite like the boat waiting at number 1, a reputation that's already survived 6 decades of changing trends, materials, and markets. At number 1, independent sources researching which boats hold value best don't hedge when this name comes up. One major used boat marketplace calls it the unsinkable legend, prized for durability, innovative design, and resale demand. A separate industry analysis goes further, describing it as the strongest example of value retention in its size category, noting that examples 10 to 15 years old can sell at prices remarkably close to their original retail cost. That's Boston Whaler, and this is one of the few resale claims in recreational boating with that much independent agreement behind it. In the early 1960s, the company famously cut one of its own boats clean in half with a saw and ran both halves separately on open water to prove they would still float and still perform. That demonstration is evidence of the company's engineering philosophy, nothing more. It doesn't by itself prove superior resale performance. What actually makes this brand the strongest case on this list is everything that's happened in the decades since. Sustained demand across very different economic conditions, not one dramatic test from over 60 years ago. The construction sandwiches a foam core between layers of fiberglass, creating a structure that resists the flexing responsible for stress cracks in less rigid designs. And that core construction philosophy has carried through decades of production without a fundamental redesign. Owner feedback consistently points to boats still in active service after 30, even 40 years, sometimes owned by the same family that purchased them new, which is a strong, long-term ownership signal, even if it's anecdotal rather than a formal survey. The honest trade-off is that maintenance runs slightly higher than some other brands, largely because parts and service carry a premium tied to the reputation itself, and fuel economy is reasonable rather than class-leading given the heavier foam-filled construction. Resale outlook, the strongest and most independently documented case on this list, built on decades of demand rather than any single moment. If you're buying with resale in mind, always ask whether the hull has ever been checked for water intrusion. A qualified surveyor can usually detect it with sound testing or a moisture meter in just a few minutes, and that single check protects more resale value on this brand than almost any other inspection step. So here's the real lesson from everything we've covered today. You cannot predict the exact price any of these boats will fetch in 2036. What you can do is stack the odds in your favor by choosing a boat with a long history of demand, construction that hasn't needed constant reinvention, a documented maintenance trail, and a reputation that's already survived more than one market cycle. Individual condition will always matter more than any brand name, but a strong track record gives you a real head start. If you had $100,000 today and knew you had to sell the boat in 2036, which one would you trust with your money? And if you think we got one completely wrong, tell us which boat should have made this list instead. If this breakdown helped you think differently about long-term boat ownership, hit like, subscribe to Harborhook Boats, and turn on notifications so you never miss the guides that could save you thousands before you buy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next Harborhook Boats adventure.